Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little darker. Lead tablets buried in tombs, inscribed with names of enemies, designed to drag souls into eternal torment. We're diving into Egyptian curse tablets that archaeologists still find unsettling. Forget the Hollywood curse nonsense. Hollywood sold you the truth. You probably wouldn't last a single day in a world where your neighbor could literally sentence your soul to eternal suffering with nothing more than a piece of metal and some very specific words. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in ancient Egypt, around 300 BCE. The good news? You're living in one of the most advanced civilizations in human history, with incredible architecture, medicine, and art. The bad news? Your annoying neighbor Kenti just discovered you've been flirting with his wife, and he's currently hunched over a lead tablet in his workshop, carefully inscribing your name in hieroglyphs while muttering incantations that are designed to make your afterlife as miserable as possible. And this is just the beginning of your problems. You can smell the acrid scent of heated metal drifting through the narrow streets of Memphis as you make your way home from the market. The sound of hammering echoes off the limestone walls, but this isn't the rhythmic beating of a blacksmith crafting tools or weapons. This is something far more sinister, the methodical pounding of cursed tablet makers, craftsmen who specialize in a very particular form of revenge that extends far beyond the grave. Welcome to the world of Egyptian execration texts, and you're about to discover why these weren't just angry letters to the gods, but sophisticated psychological warfare that could destroy lives, families, and entire bloodlines. The workshop you're passing belongs to Amenemheb, a scribe who's built his entire career around helping people curse their enemies. His fingers are permanently stained black from the ink he uses, and his eyes have developed a peculiar gleam that comes from spending years perfecting the art of spiritual destruction. The lead tablet he's working on right now contains the name of a tax collector who's been demanding bribes from local merchants. But this isn't just about writing down a name and hoping for the best. Amenemheb follows a specific protocol that's been passed down through generations of curse makers, each step designed to ensure maximum effectiveness in binding the victim's soul to eternal torment. First, he heats the lead until it's soft enough to inscribe clearly. The choice of lead isn't random. This metal is associated with the underworld, cold and heavy, like the depths of the earth, where the cursed souls will be dragged. As he works, he mutters specific incantations under his breath, words that invoke the power of Set, the god of chaos and destruction, along with various demons and underworld entities who specialize in tormenting the dead. The inscription process itself is an art form. Amenemheb doesn't just write the victim's name, he includes their father's name, their mother's name, their profession, and even their address. The more specific the identification, the more powerful the curse becomes. But it gets worse. He also includes detailed descriptions of exactly what he wants to happen to this person, both in life and in death. The language is graphic, methodical, and designed to leave no escape routes for the victim's soul. And this is just the beginning. Once the inscription is complete, Amenemheb will perform a binding ritual that involves specific gestures, more incantations, and the symbolic burial of the tablet in a location that corresponds to the type of curse being cast. Revenge curses get buried in cemeteries, love curses go into wells or rivers, and business curses are often placed in the foundations of buildings or buried at crossroads. The psychological impact of these curses on Egyptian society cannot be overstated. People lived in constant fear that their enemies might be crafting tablets with their names on them. The mere rumor that someone had commissioned a curse could destroy a person's reputation, their business relationships, and their social standing. Families would sometimes discover cursed tablets hidden in their homes, leading to paranoia and accusations that could tear entire communities apart. But here's what makes Egyptian curse tablets particularly terrifying. They weren't just about immediate revenge. These curses were designed to follow victims into the afterlife, interfering with the judgment process that determined whether their souls would be admitted to paradise or condemned to eternal torment. In a culture where the afterlife was considered more important than mortal existence, this was the ultimate form of warfare. The morning sun filters through the narrow windows of the temple complex as you witness the most chilling sight in ancient Egypt, a professional curse ceremony in progress. The priest conducting this ritual isn't some wild-eyed fanatic or desperate peasant seeking revenge. He's a respected member of the religious hierarchy, trained in the precise methodologies of spiritual warfare that have been refined over centuries of practice. The victim whose name is being inscribed on the lead tablet will never know what's happening to them until it's far too late. That's the beauty and horror of Egyptian curse tablets. They operate in complete secrecy, striking at the spiritual level before manifesting in the physical world. The priest's fingers move with practiced precision as he carves hieroglyphs that will bind the target's soul to a fate worse than death. Welcome to the technical aspects of Egyptian execration, where every symbol, every word, and every gesture has been calculated for maximum spiritual damage. The lead tablet being prepared today contains a curse that will follow its victim through multiple lifetimes, interfering with their reincarnation process and ensuring that their soul never finds peace. The priest understands that death is not the end, as simply the beginning of a much longer and more sophisticated form of punishment. The hieroglyphs being carved aren't just random symbols or angry threats. They're written in a specific magical language that corresponds to the sacred texts of the underworld, invoking powers that most Egyptians wouldn't dare to name aloud. The priest begins with an invocation to Apophis, the serpent of chaos who opposes the sun god Ra, calling upon this entity to devour the victim's soul during their journey through the afterlife. But the inscription process involves much more than simply writing down names and threats. The priest includes detailed instructions for the underworld entities about exactly how the victim should be tortured. These instructions are so specific that they read like a manual for spiritual warfare, describing methods of soul binding that would make medieval torture devices seem merciful by comparison. The lead tablet also contains what archaeologists call identification formulae, detailed descriptions of the victim that go far beyond their name and parentage. The priest includes information about the victim's physical appearance, their mannerisms, their fears, their desires, and even their dreams. This level of detail ensures that the curse will find its target, no matter how they try to hide or protect themselves. And this is just the preparation phase. Once the inscription is complete, the priest will perform a series of rituals that activate the curse and bind it to the victim's spiritual essence. These rituals involve burning specific incense, reciting incantations in the ancient language of the gods, and performing symbolic actions that represent the destruction of the victim's soul. The psychological sophistication of these curses is remarkable. The priests understood that the most effective curses weren't just about causing immediate harm, they were about creating a sense of inevitable doom that would slowly destroy the victim's will to live. The curse would manifest gradually through a series of seemingly random misfortunes that would eventually drive the victim to despair and madness. The priest conducting today's ceremony has been trained in these methods since childhood, learning not just the technical aspects of curse making, but also the psychological principles that make them effective. He understands that fear is the most powerful weapon in spiritual warfare, and that a properly crafted curse can destroy a person's life without ever touching their physical body. The social implications of this practice were staggering. In a society where professional curse makers operated openly and legally, personal conflicts could escalate into spiritual warfare that might last for generations. Families would pass down curses like inheritances, ensuring that their enemies' descendants would suffer for crimes committed by their ancestors centuries earlier. The narrow alleyways behind the temple complex buzz with whispered conversations and the exchange of silver coins as you discover the thriving underground economy built around professional cursing services. This isn't some primitive superstition practiced by desperate outcasts. It's a sophisticated business network that employs hundreds of specialized craftsmen, from tablet makers to ritual specialists to curse delivery experts, who ensure that the finished products reach their intended spiritual destinations. Welcome to the economic ecosystem of Egyptian execration, where revenge has become a commodity and spiritual warfare generates enough revenue to support entire neighborhoods. The workshop you're entering belongs to Kemwaset, a master curse maker whose reputation extends throughout the region. His waiting room is filled with clients from all social classes, each carrying their own stories of betrayal, injustice, and the burning desire for revenge that money can buy. The price list posted on the wall reveals the terrifying sophistication of this industry. A basic curse tablet costs about a month's wages for a skilled craftsman, but that's just the entry-level service. Premium curses, designed to follow victims through multiple lifetimes, can cost as much as a small house. The most expensive option on the menu is something called an eternal binding, which comes with a guarantee that the victim's soul will never find peace, no matter how many times they're reincarnated. But this isn't just about individual revenge. Kemwaset's client list includes business competitors looking to destroy rival merchants, politicians seeking to eliminate their opponents, and even grieving families who want to ensure that their loved ones' killers suffer appropriately in the afterlife. The democratization of spiritual warfare has created a society where anyone with enough money can purchase the services of the gods' most destructive servants. The production process itself resembles a medieval assembly line, with different specialists handling each aspect of the curse creation. The tablet makers focus on selecting the appropriate metal and preparing the surface for inscription. The scribes handle the actual writing, using their knowledge of sacred hieroglyphs to craft curses that will resonate with the powers of the underworld. The ritual specialists perform the activation ceremonies that bind the curses to their targets. And this is just the beginning of the supply chain. Once the curse tablets are complete, they need to be delivered to specific locations where they can take effect. This has created an entire sub-industry of curse delivery specialists who know the most effective burial sites, the proper depths for different types of curses, and the timing requirements that ensure maximum spiritual impact. The quality control standards in this industry are remarkably high. Chaim Wasset offers a satisfaction guarantee on all his curses, promising that if the victim doesn't suffer visible consequences within a specified time frame, he'll craft a replacement curse at no additional charge. This level of customer service has built him a loyal clientele that includes some of the most powerful people in Egyptian society. The psychological impact of this commercialization cannot be overstated. When spiritual warfare becomes a business transaction, it loses much of its emotional weight and becomes simply another tool for solving problems. The clients sitting in Chaim Wasset's waiting room discuss their intended victims with the same casual tone they might use when ordering furniture or planning a dinner party. The record-keeping requirements alone reveal the sophisticated nature of this industry. Chaim Wasset maintains detailed files on every curse he creates, including the victim's information, the specific methods requested, the expected timeline for results, and follow-up notes about the curse's effectiveness. These records serve multiple purposes. They help him refine his techniques, provide evidence for his satisfaction guarantees, and create a historical archive of spiritual warfare that spans decades. The social networking aspects of the curse industry are equally fascinating. Clients often share recommendations, comparing the effectiveness of different curse makers and discussing the relative merits of various cursing methodologies. This word-of-mouth marketing has created a reputation-based economy where the most skilled curse makers command premium prices and maintain waiting lists of clients seeking their services. But the most disturbing aspect of this commercialization is how it has normalized the practice of spiritual warfare. In a society where curse making is a legitimate profession, the line between justice and revenge becomes increasingly blurred, and the psychological barriers that might prevent someone from seeking to destroy another person's soul are systematically removed. The temple laboratory, where you find yourself, is unlike anything you might expect from ancient religious practices. Stone tables are covered with precisely measured metal alloys, carefully ground pigments, and instruments that look more like surgical tools than religious artifacts. The priest working here, Amenhotep, is conducting what can only be described as spiritual chemistry, combining specific materials and incantations in ratios that have been tested and refined over centuries of experimentation. Welcome to the scientific methodology behind Egyptian curse tablets, where supernatural warfare meets systematic research and development. The process you're witnessing isn't based on superstition or emotional outbursts. It's the result of generations of priests who approached cursing with the same methodical precision that their colleagues applied to medicine, astronomy, and engineering. The lead tablet being prepared today represents the culmination of years of research into the most effective methods of soul binding. Amenhotep begins by selecting the specific type of lead that will be used, explaining that different lead sources produce different spiritual resonances. Lead mined from certain regions is believed to have stronger connections to the underworld, while lead that has been exposed to specific types of mineral deposits carries enhanced binding properties. The inscription process itself follows protocols that have been documented in sacred texts dating back over 1,000 years. Each hieroglyph must be carved to precise depths with specific angles and orientations that correspond to the spiritual forces being invoked. The priest uses measuring instruments to ensure that the symbols are exactly the right size and spacing, understanding that even small variations can dramatically affect the curse's effectiveness. But the most sophisticated aspect of this process involves the layering of multiple curse types within a single tablet. Amenhotep explains that modern curse makers have learned to combine different cursing methodologies to create hybrid curses that are virtually impossible to counteract. The tablet he's working on today contains elements of binding curses, confusion curses, and separation curses, all woven together in a pattern that will systematically destroy every aspect of the victim's life. The timing of the curse activation is calculated using astronomical observations and religious calendar systems that track the movements of gods and demons through the spiritual realm. Amenhotep consults charts that show the optimal times for different types of curses, taking into account factors like the victim's birth date, the current lunar phase, and the positions of specific stars that are associated with underworld powers. And this is just the preparation phase. The actual activation ritual involves a series of precisely timed actions that must be performed in exact sequence to ensure that the curse bonds properly with the victim's spiritual essence. Amenhotep demonstrates the proper hand positions, the correct pronunciation of incantations, and the specific breathing patterns that focus the curse maker's spiritual energy into the lead tablet. The quality testing procedures used in professional curse making rival those found in any modern laboratory. Amenhotep maintains detailed records of every curse he creates, tracking their effectiveness over time and using this data to refine his techniques. He's developed standardized methods for measuring curse strength, duration, and accuracy, allowing him to guarantee specific results to his clients. The metallurgical knowledge required for effective curse making is surprisingly advanced. Different metals are used for different types of curses, with each metal requiring specific preparation methods to maximize its spiritual conductivity. Amenhotep shows you samples of lead that has been treated with various chemical processes, each designed to enhance the metal's ability to bind with supernatural forces. The linguistic research that goes into curse development is equally impressive. Amenhotep has studied variations in hieroglyphic spelling that can dramatically affect a curse's power, and he's developed new combinations of symbols that create more precise targeting mechanisms. The language used in modern curse tablets is the result of centuries of trial and error, with successful formulations being passed down through generations of practitioners. The psychological profiling techniques used to customize curses for specific victims represent perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of this practice. Amenhotep maintains detailed files on personality types, explaining that different cursing approaches work better on different kinds of people. Proud individuals respond better to humiliation curses, while fearful people are more susceptible to terror-based spiritual attacks. The cross-referencing systems used to prevent curse interference are remarkably complex. When multiple curses are targeted at the same victim, they can sometimes cancel each other out or create unexpected side effects. Amenhotep has developed methods for checking whether his intended target is already under spiritual attack, allowing him to adjust his approach accordingly. Deep beneath the temple complex, in chambers that most priests never see, you encounter the true power structure behind Egyptian curse tablets. The room is filled with statues and inscriptions depicting entities that exist in the spaces between life and death, spiritual beings who have been recruited, bargained with, and sometimes enslaved to serve as the enforcement arm of Egyptian curse-making operations. Welcome to the supernatural bureaucracy that makes Egyptian execration possible, where demons, minor gods, and restless spirits operate under contracts that bind them to specific types of spiritual warfare. The priest conducting today's ritual, Ptahhotep, serves as something like a supernatural human resources manager, matching appropriate spiritual entities with the specific requirements of different curse types. The entity being summoned for today's curse is Amam, a demon who specializes in devouring the memories of the recently deceased. The victim, whose name is inscribed on the lead tablet, will find that their consciousness becomes increasingly fragmented after death, making it impossible for them to successfully navigate the judgment process that determines their fate in the afterlife. This is spiritual warfare at its most sophisticated, not just destroying the victim's mortal life, but systematically dismantling their ability to achieve eternal peace. The summoning process itself reveals the complex negotiation systems that govern relationships between Egyptian curse makers and the supernatural entities they employ. Ptahhotep doesn't simply command these beings to do his bidding. He engages in elaborate bargaining sessions where specific terms of service are negotiated for each curse. The demons demand payment in the form of spiritual energy, usually harvested from the curse maker's own life force or from sacrificial offerings provided by the client. But the most disturbing aspect of this system is how it has created a competitive marketplace among supernatural entities. Different demons specialize in different types of spiritual destruction, and they actively compete for contracts with Egyptian curse makers. Ptahhotep shows you ledgers that track the performance ratings of various entities, noting which demons are most effective at specific types of soul binding and which ones require the least supervision to complete their assignments. The hierarchy among these supernatural servants is remarkably complex. Higher-level entities like fallen gods and major demons command premium prices, but can accomplish more sophisticated forms of spiritual warfare. Lower-level entities like restless spirits and minor demons are less expensive, but require more detailed instructions and closer supervision. The most powerful entities can craft curses that will follow victims through multiple reincarnations, while weaker entities are limited to single lifetime effects. And this is just the tip of the supernatural iceberg. Ptahhotep explains that the most successful curse makers have developed long-term relationships with specific entities, building trust and understanding that allows for more effective collaboration. These relationships often span decades, with demons learning to anticipate their human partner's preferences and developing specialized techniques that cater to specific client needs. The quality control systems that govern these supernatural partnerships are surprisingly sophisticated. Ptahhotep maintains detailed performance records for every entity he works with, tracking their success rates, their reliability, and their tendency to cause unexpected side effects. Entities that consistently underperform are gradually phased out of the rotation, while those that exceed expectations are rewarded with better contracts and more interesting assignments. The training programs for new supernatural servants reveal the systematic nature of this industry. Young demons are apprenticed to experienced entities, learning the specific techniques required for different types of spiritual warfare. They practice on test subjects, refining their abilities until they can reliably produce the effects demanded by their human contractors. The territorial agreements that prevent supernatural entities from interfering with each other's work create a complex web of spiritual politics. Different demons have exclusive rights to specific types of curse work, and violations of these agreements can lead to supernatural conflicts that spill over into the mortal world. Ptahhotep serves as a mediator in these disputes, using his knowledge of supernatural law to resolve conflicts and maintain the stability of the curse-making industry. The retirement and pension systems for supernatural servants who have served faithfully for extended periods demonstrate the long-term thinking that characterizes this industry. Entities that have completed thousands of successful curse assignments are rewarded with lighter duties and better working conditions, while those that have been particularly innovative in their approaches are allowed to train the next generation of supernatural servants. The insurance policies that protect curse makers from supernatural backlash represent perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of this system. Ptahhotep maintains contracts with protective entities who specialize in defending curse makers from revenge attacks by rival supernatural servants. These guardian entities monitor the spiritual atmosphere around active curse makers, providing early warning of potential threats and neutralizing hostile supernatural forces before they can cause harm. The marketplace of Memphis bustles with normal daily life as you observe the tragic irony of Egyptian curse culture. The victims who continue their routines completely unaware that their names have been inscribed on lead tablets and buried in locations specifically chosen to maximize their spiritual suffering. The merchant arguing with a customer over the price of grain has no idea that his business rival commissioned a curse 2 weeks ago designed to systematically destroy his reputation and drive him to financial ruin. Welcome to the hidden casualties of Egyptian execration, where ordinary people become targets of sophisticated spiritual warfare without ever knowing they're under attack. The woman buying bread for her family doesn't realize that her husband's ex-wife has paid a professional curse maker to ensure that their children will suffer mysterious illnesses that gradually weaken them until they become vulnerable to premature death. The psychological cruelty of this system extends far beyond the immediate effects of the curses themselves. Victims often spend years trying to understand why their lives have suddenly taken a turn for the worse, consulting doctors who can't explain their symptoms, seeking advice from priests who may themselves be involved in the curse-making industry, and gradually losing their sanity as they search for rational explanations for supernatural attacks. The young scribe copying documents in the temple courtyard has been experiencing a series of increasingly severe headaches, but he attributes them to eye strain from his work. He doesn't know that his former teacher, angry about a perceived slight, has commissioned a curse designed to gradually destroy his ability to concentrate and remember information. The curse is working exactly as intended, but the victim's rational mind keeps seeking natural explanations for supernatural symptoms. But the most heartbreaking aspect of this system involves the innocent family members who become collateral damage in curse attacks. The tablet being prepared today targets not just the primary victim, but also their spouse, their children, and even their future descendants. The curse maker explains that modern execration techniques have evolved to include bloodline binding, curses that automatically transfer to new generations, ensuring that the victim's family suffers for crimes they didn't commit and conflicts they know nothing about. The social isolation that develops around curse victims is particularly insidious. As their circumstances deteriorate, friends and family members begin to distance themselves, partly out of fear that they might be associated with whatever has brought this misfortune, and partly because Egyptian culture includes strong beliefs about spiritual contagion. The idea that prolonged contact with cursed individuals can transfer some of the negative effects to innocent bystanders. And this is just the beginning of the victim's ordeal. The curse tablets being used in modern Egyptian execration are designed to activate in stages, with new symptoms and complications appearing at regular intervals over months or years. The victim experiences what appears to be a series of unrelated misfortunes, but each event is actually part of a carefully orchestrated campaign of spiritual destruction. The medical professionals who treat curse victims often find themselves confronting symptoms that don't respond to conventional treatments. The physician examining the merchant's mysterious stomach ailments has no way of knowing that the pain is being caused by a demon who has been contracted to slowly devour the victim's internal organs from the spiritual level. The treatments prescribed by the doctor may provide temporary relief, but they can't address the supernatural root cause of the problem. The religious counselors who try to help curse victims face similar challenges. The priest advising the woman whose children keep having nightmares doesn't realize that the dreams are being directly implanted by a specialized entity that feeds on childhood terror. The protective rituals and prayers he recommends may provide some comfort, but they're ineffective against professionally crafted curses that have been designed to bypass conventional spiritual defenses. The economic impact on curse victims and their families can be devastating. The merchant whose business is being systematically destroyed by curse-induced accidents and coincidences watches his life's work disappear without understanding why his usual strategies are no longer effective. His family faces poverty and social disgrace, but they have no idea that their suffering is the result of a calculated spiritual attack, rather than natural market forces. The legal system offers no protection for curse victims, partly because the attacks are invisible, and partly because many judges and lawyers are themselves clients of the curse-making industry. The woman whose husband died under mysterious circumstances can't prove that his death was caused by supernatural means, and the investigation into his death focuses on physical evidence that will never reveal the true cause of his demise. The intergenerational trauma caused by curse attacks creates cycles of suffering that can last for centuries. Children who grow up in cursed families often develop psychological problems that they pass on to their own children, creating patterns of dysfunction that persist long after the original curse has run its course. The spiritual damage becomes embedded in family structures, affecting future generations in ways that are impossible to trace back to their supernatural origins. The temple complex you're exploring today houses a completely different kind of spiritual warfare, the professional counter-curse industry that has evolved to protect wealthy Egyptians from the epidemic of curse attacks that plague their society. The priest working here, Neferhotep, specializes in defensive spiritual warfare, using sophisticated detection methods to identify incoming curse attacks and neutralizing them before they can cause permanent damage. Welcome to the arms race of Egyptian execration, where curse makers and curse breakers engage in increasingly sophisticated battles that play out in the spiritual realm while their clients live in fear of supernatural attacks they can't see or understand. The workshop you're entering contains instruments and artifacts that look more like military equipment than religious paraphernalia, reflecting the deadly serious nature of this spiritual conflict. The detection systems used by professional curse breakers are remarkably advanced. Neferhotep demonstrates a series of diagnostic rituals that can identify the specific type of curse being used against a client, the spiritual entities involved in the attack, and the approximate timeline for when the curse will reach maximum effectiveness. These diagnostic techniques have been refined over centuries of practice, allowing experienced curse breakers to provide their clients with detailed intelligence about incoming spiritual attacks. The protective services offered by the counter-curse industry range from basic spiritual hygiene to comprehensive defensive packages that include 24-hour supernatural monitoring. Neferhotep's basic service involves performing regular cleansing rituals that remove low-level curse effects and create temporary spiritual barriers around the client. His premium service includes permanent protective installations that monitor the client's spiritual environment and automatically neutralize incoming curse attacks. But the most sophisticated aspect of this industry involves the development of offensive countermeasures designed to strike back at the curse makers themselves. Neferhotep explains that the most effective defense against curse attacks is often a preemptive strike that neutralizes the curse maker before they can complete their work. This has created a shadowy world of spiritual assassination, where curse breakers hunt down their clients' enemies and systematically destroy their ability to craft effective curses. The intelligence networks maintained by counter-curse specialists rival those of any military organization. Neferhotep maintains detailed files on every known curse maker in the region, tracking their methods, their clients, and their current projects. This information allows him to predict when his clients might become targets and to take preventive action before curses can be activated. And this is just the defensive side of the business. The counter-curse industry also offers revenge services for clients who have been successfully attacked by curse makers. These revenge curses are typically more powerful than the original attacks, designed to not only neutralize the enemy curse maker, but also to serve as a deterrent to other potential attackers. The message is clear: anyone who attacks a client protected by professional counter-curse services will face devastating retaliation. The technological innovations developed by curse breakers have revolutionized the spiritual warfare industry. Neferhotep shows you artifacts that can detect curse tablets from a distance, allowing his agents to locate and neutralize buried curses before they can take effect. He's also developed portable protective devices that clients can carry with them to provide constant spiritual defense against surprise attacks. The training programs for counter-curse specialists are incredibly rigorous, requiring years of study in both offensive and defensive spiritual warfare techniques. Students learn to identify dozens of different curse types, master the specific counter rituals required to neutralize each type, and develop the mental discipline necessary to engage in prolonged spiritual combat without losing their sanity. The quality assurance systems used by the counter-curse industry are necessarily more sophisticated than those used by curse makers, since the stakes are higher and the clients are typically more demanding. Neferhotep maintains detailed records of every protective service he provides, tracking the effectiveness of his methods and constantly refining his techniques based on real-world results. The ethical considerations that govern the counter-curse industry are complex and often contradictory. While curse breakers position themselves as protectors of innocent victims, they're also active participants in the spiritual warfare industry, and their offensive capabilities often exceed those of the curse makers they're fighting against. The line between protection and aggression becomes increasingly blurred as the spiritual arms race escalates. The economic impact of the counter-curse industry on Egyptian society is staggering.
Wealthy families often spend more on spiritual protection than they do on physical security, and the demand for counter-curse services has created a parallel economy that employs thousands of specialists. The industry has become so profitable that some curse makers have transitioned into counter-curse work, using their knowledge of offensive techniques to develop more effective defensive strategies. The social stratification created by the counter-curse industry is particularly disturbing. Only wealthy clients can afford comprehensive spiritual protection, while ordinary Egyptians remain vulnerable to curse attacks. This has created a two-tier society where the rich live in relative safety while the poor face constant threat of supernatural warfare with no means of defending themselves.
The excavation site outside Memphis reveals the physical evidence of Egyptian curse culture as archaeologists carefully uncover lead tablets that have been buried for over 2,000 years. The preservation of these artifacts is remarkable, but what's even more striking is the sheer volume of curse tablets being discovered, evidence of a society where spiritual warfare was so common that curse makers couldn't keep up with demand. Welcome to the archaeological record of Egyptian execration, where modern scholars are discovering the true extent of ancient spiritual warfare through systematic excavation of cursed tablet deposits. The site you're observing today has yielded over 300 cursed tablets from a single burial ground, representing decades of accumulated hatred and revenge that was literally buried beneath the feet of ancient Egyptian citizens. The excavation process itself requires special precautions that reflect the continuing power attributed to these ancient curses. The archaeological team includes specialists in ancient Egyptian religion who perform protective rituals before disturbing the cursed tablet burials, acknowledging that some of the spiritual forces bound to these artifacts may still be active after centuries of dormancy. The variety of cursed tablets being discovered reveals the sophisticated nature of ancient Egyptian execration practices. Each tablet represents a different approach to spiritual warfare, with varying degrees of complexity and malevolence. The archaeologists have developed a classification system that categorizes curses by their intended effects, their target populations, and their methods of activation. But the most disturbing discoveries involve cursed tablets that were designed to remain active indefinitely. These eternal curses were crafted with specific provisions for transferring their effects to future generations, ensuring that the victims' descendants would continue to suffer for crimes committed by their ancestors. The archaeological evidence suggests that some of these curses may have been effective for centuries, creating patterns of family misfortune that persisted through multiple generations. The personal details included in many curse tablets provide intimate glimpses into the daily conflicts and resentments that drove ancient Egyptians to seek supernatural revenge. The tablets contain names, addresses, physical descriptions, and even personal habits of the intended victims, revealing a level of surveillance and stalking that would be considered criminal in modern society. And this is just what's been discovered in organized burial sites. The archaeologists explain that curse tablets were often buried in random locations throughout ancient Egyptian cities, meaning that the true extent of curse tablet usage may never be known. Every construction project in areas with significant Egyptian settlements has the potential to uncover additional evidence of ancient spiritual warfare. The preservation techniques used for curse tablets reveal the long-term thinking that characterized Egyptian curse making, Many tablets were sealed in protective containers designed to prevent deterioration while ensuring that the curses remained active. The metallurgical analysis of these containers shows that curse makers used advanced techniques to create storage systems that could last for millennia. The linguistic analysis of curse tablet inscriptions has revealed the evolution of Egyptian curse making over time. Early tablets use relatively simple language and straightforward threats, while later tablets employ increasingly sophisticated magical formulations that draw on centuries of accumulated knowledge about spiritual warfare. The progression shows a clear development from amateur curse making to professional spiritual warfare. The statistical analysis of curse tablet discoveries provides insights into the demographics of ancient Egyptian execration. The data shows that curse tablets were used by people from all social classes, with wealthy clients commissioning elaborate curses, while ordinary citizens used simpler, more affordable cursing methods. The geographic distribution of curse tablets reveals that spiritual warfare was practiced throughout Egyptian society, not just in major urban centers. The conservation challenges faced by archaeologists working with curse tablets are unique in the field of Egyptian archaeology. The lead tablets are often fragile, and the inscription techniques used by ancient curse makers can make the text difficult to read without damaging the artifact. Specialized equipment and techniques have been developed specifically for curse tablet conservation. The ethical considerations surrounding curse tablet research are complex and ongoing. Some scholars argue that studying these artifacts risks activating dormant curses, while others maintain that the historical value of the information outweighs the potential spiritual risks. The debate has led to the development of specific protocols for curse tablet research that balance academic inquiry with respect for ancient religious beliefs. The digitization projects that are making curse tablet inscriptions available to researchers worldwide have revealed connections between curses that were previously unknown. Pattern recognition software has identified recurring names, phrases, and formulaic elements that suggest the existence of curse-making schools or professional networks that shared techniques and methodologies. The international collaboration required for curse tablet research has created a global network of scholars who specialize in ancient Egyptian spiritual warfare. These researchers share information about new discoveries, collaborate on translation projects, and work together to develop new analytical techniques for understanding the full scope of ancient Egyptian execration practices. The consultation chamber, where you observe today's session, reveals the sophisticated psychological manipulation techniques used by professional curse makers to extract maximum payment from their clients, while ensuring that the cursing process provides satisfying emotional closure for people seeking supernatural revenge. The priest conducting this consultation, Amenemhab, functions as part spiritual advisor, part therapist, and part salesman, carefully managing his clients' expectations while building their confidence in the curse-making process. Welcome to the psychological dimensions of Egyptian execration, where curse makers have developed sophisticated understanding of human motivation, emotional satisfaction, and the therapeutic value of ritualized revenge. The client sitting across from Amenemhab is a wealthy merchant whose business partner has cheated him out of a substantial sum of money, and the consultation process reveals how curse makers transform personal grievances into profitable spiritual warfare contracts. The intake process begins with what modern psychologists would recognize as a structured interview designed to maximize the client's emotional investment in the cursing process. Amenemhab asks detailed questions about the nature of the grievance, the specific ways the client has been wronged, and the types of suffering they believe their enemy deserves. But these aren't just fact-finding questions. They're carefully crafted prompts designed to intensify the client's anger and create a sense of righteous indignation that justifies extreme revenge. The emotional manipulation techniques used during these consultations are remarkably sophisticated. Amenemhab validates his client's feelings, agrees that the wrongs committed against them are intolerable, and gradually escalates the conversation until the client becomes convinced that supernatural revenge is not just justified, but necessary for maintaining their dignity and social standing. The psychological pressure applied during these sessions often results in clients commissioning more expensive and elaborate curses than they originally intended. But the most insidious aspect of this process involves the way curse makers exploit their clients' fears about social status and reputation. Egyptian society places enormous emphasis on maintaining face and demonstrating strength in the face of adversity. Amenemhab skillfully plays on these cultural values, suggesting that failure to take decisive action against enemies will be perceived as weakness and will encourage future attacks from other adversaries. The satisfaction guarantee offered by professional curse makers serves multiple psychological functions beyond simple customer service. The guarantee creates confidence in the cursing process, reduces the client's anxiety about spending large sums of money on intangible services, and provides a framework for measuring the curse's effectiveness that helps clients feel they're receiving value for their investment. And this is just the initial consultation phase. The psychological benefits provided by the curse-making process extend far beyond the actual supernatural effects of the curses themselves. Many clients report feeling immediate relief after commissioning a curse, describing a sense of emotional closure and restored personal power that comes from taking decisive action against their enemies. The ritualistic aspects of curse commissioning provide additional psychological benefits that curse makers have learned to maximize for therapeutic effect. The process of providing detailed information about the intended victim, participating in the curse activation ceremony, and witnessing the burial of the completed curse tablet creates a sense of active participation that helps clients feel they've regained control over situations where they previously felt helpless. The follow-up services provided by curse makers include regular progress reports that help maintain the client's confidence in the curse's effectiveness. Amenhab explains that clients often need ongoing reassurance that their investment is producing results, especially when the curse effects are subtle or take time to manifest. These progress reports serve to sustain the client's psychological satisfaction with the cursing process. The group therapy aspects of the curse-making industry are rarely discussed, but play an important role in sustaining client satisfaction. Amenhab's waiting room functions as an informal support group where clients share their experiences, compare their grievances, and reinforce each other's belief in the effectiveness of supernatural revenge. These interactions create a community of shared experience that validates the decision to seek curse-making services. The addiction potential inherent in curse-making services represents one of the industry's most profitable aspects. Clients who experience satisfaction from their first curse
often become repeat customers, commissioning additional curses against new enemies or upgrading their existing curses to more powerful versions. Amenhab maintains long-term relationships with clients who have been using his services for decades. The psychological profiling techniques used to customize curse recommendations for different personality types demonstrate the sophistication of modern curse-making practices. Amenhab has developed detailed understanding of how different types of people respond to various forms of supernatural revenge, allowing him to recommend curse types that will provide maximum emotional satisfaction for each individual client. The conflict resolution services offered by some curse makers reveal the industry's evolution beyond simple revenge into broader psychological counseling. Amenhab sometimes mediates disputes between clients, helping them find alternatives to mutual cursing that might be more beneficial for everyone involved. These mediation services generate additional revenue while positioning curse makers as wise counselors rather than simple revenge merchants. The referral networks maintained by curse makers include relationships with other types of service providers who can address different aspects of their clients' problems. Amenhab works with lawyers, physicians, and business consultants, creating comprehensive support systems that address both the supernatural and practical dimensions of his clients' conflicts.
The schoolyard, where you observe today's tragic scene, reveals one of the most heartbreaking aspects of Egyptian curse culture: the innocent children who inherit the spiritual warfare, conflicts of their parents and grandparents, often suffering from supernatural attacks they don't understand and can't defend against. The young boy sitting alone under the palm tree, avoided by his classmates, carries the burden of a family curse that has marked his bloodline for destruction across multiple generations. Welcome to the intergenerational trauma created by Egyptian execration practices, where the sins of the fathers are literally visited upon their children through sophisticated curse mechanisms designed to ensure that entire family lines suffer for the conflicts of their ancestors. The child you're watching has never harmed anyone, but his grandfather's business disputes have sentenced him to a lifetime of social isolation, mysterious illnesses, and psychological torment that will follow him until the curse finally achieves its ultimate goal of bloodline extinction. The hereditary curse affecting this boy was crafted using bloodline binding techniques that automatically transfer supernatural attacks to new generations as they're born. The curse maker who created this particular spiritual weapon included specific provisions that ensure the effects become more severe with each generation, gradually intensifying until the family line is completely destroyed. The boy's father suffered mild symptoms, but the boy himself experiences debilitating headaches, unexplained fears, and an inability to form lasting friendships. The social stigma attached to cursed children creates additional layers of suffering that compound the supernatural effects of the original curse. The other children in the schoolyard have been warned by their parents to avoid contact with the cursed boy, partly out of fear that the curse effects might be contagious, and partly because association with cursed families can damage a family's social standing. The isolation experienced by these children often causes psychological damage that persists long after the original curse has run its course. But the most devastating aspect of hereditary cursing involves the way these supernatural attacks interfere with normal child development. The cursed boy you're observing shows classic symptoms of what modern psychologists would recognize as severe anxiety disorder, but the underlying cause of his condition
is supernatural rather than psychological. Traditional treatments are ineffective because they can't address the spiritual dimension of his suffering. The educational challenges faced by cursed children often prevent them from developing the skills and knowledge they need to break free from their family's supernatural bondage. The boy's concentration problems, caused by the curse's effects on his mental clarity, make it difficult for him to succeed in his studies. His teachers, unaware of the supernatural factors affecting his performance, attribute his difficulties to laziness or lack of ability, creating additional pressure that exacerbates his psychological distress. And this is just the beginning of his ordeal. As he reaches adolescence, the hereditary curse will begin affecting his ability to form romantic relationships, ensuring that he remains isolated and alone. If he does manage to marry and have children, the curse will transfer to his offspring, perpetuating the cycle of suffering for another generation. The medical professionals who examine cursed children often find themselves confronting symptoms that don't respond to conventional treatments. The physicians treating the boy's mysterious ailments have no way of understanding that his physical problems are manifestations of supernatural attacks that specifically target his family's bloodline. The treatments they prescribe may provide temporary relief, but they can't address the spiritual root cause of his condition. The religious counselors who try to help cursed children face similar challenges in providing effective support. The priests who have examined the boy's case understand that he's suffering from supernatural attacks, but the hereditary curse affecting his family was crafted by professionals who built multiple layers of spiritual protection into their work. Breaking such curses requires specialized knowledge and resources that most priests don't possess. The family dynamics created by hereditary cursing often result in additional trauma for the affected children. The boy's parents blame themselves for their son's suffering, but they also resent the financial and emotional burden created by his condition. The family's attempts to find effective treatment have consumed their savings and damaged their relationships with extended family members who fear being associated with their curse. The survival strategies developed by cursed children often involve forms of self-isolation that protect them from additional supernatural attacks, but also prevent them from developing normal social skills. The boy has learned to avoid situations where he might become the target of new curses, but this defensive behavior also limits his opportunities for positive experiences and personal growth. The underground support networks that have developed among families affected by hereditary curses provide some relief, but they also reinforce the sense of being separate from normal society. These families share information about treatments, protective measures, and coping strategies, but their interactions also serve as constant reminders of their supernatural affliction. The black market treatments available for hereditary curse victims include both legitimate spiritual services and fraudulent schemes that exploit desperate families. The boy's parents have spent small fortunes on various curse-breaking attempts, most of which have been ineffective. The legitimate counter-curse specialists charge prices that are beyond the reach of most families, while the cheaper alternatives are often scams that provide false hope without real results. The documentation requirements for hereditary curse cases create additional burdens for affected families. Proving that a child's problems are caused by supernatural rather than natural factors requires extensive spiritual investigation that most families can't afford. Without proper documentation, cursed children can't access specialized services that might help alleviate their suffering. The long-term prognosis for children affected by hereditary curses depends largely on their family's financial resources and social connections. Wealthy families can sometimes afford the counter-curse services needed to break hereditary spiritual attacks, but ordinary families often watch helplessly as their children suffer from supernatural afflictions that gradually destroy their lives and futures.
The hidden bazaar beneath the streets of Thebes operates in the shadows of Egyptian society, where desperate people seek supernatural solutions that the legitimate curse-making industry won't provide. The vendors here don't operate temples or maintain respectable businesses. They're spiritual criminals who deal in the darkest forms of execration, offering services that even professional curse makers consider too dangerous or morally reprehensible to perform. Welcome to the black market of Egyptian spiritual warfare, where amateur curse makers and rogue priests sell supernatural weapons to clients who have been rejected by legitimate spiritual warriors, or who need types of cursing that aren't available through legal channels. The marketplace you're entering tonight caters to the desperate, the vengeful, and the morally corrupted, offering curse services that can destroy not just individual victims, but entire communities. The clientele browsing these shadowy stalls includes people whose curse requests have been turned down by professional curse makers due to ethical concerns or practical limitations. The woman examining a collection of bone tablets wants to curse her infant nephew to ensure that her own son inherits the family business. The man haggling over the price of a blood curse seeks to destroy his entire neighborhood because he believes his neighbors are gossiping about his wife's infidelity. The quality control standards in these underground markets are non-existent, resulting in curse products that are often more dangerous to the user than to the intended victim. The amateur curse makers working these stalls lack the training and experience necessary to safely handle the supernatural forces they're attempting to manipulate, and their products frequently malfunction in ways that cause unexpected collateral damage. But the most disturbing aspect of these illegal markets involves the trafficking of supernatural entities that have been captured or enslaved specifically for use in unauthorized curse making. The vendors here deal in demons that have been torn from their natural spiritual habitats and bound to serve in cursing operations without the proper contractual agreements that legitimate curse makers maintain with their supernatural partners. The pricing structure in these underground markets reflects the desperate nature of the clientele and the illegal status of the services being provided. Basic curses that might cost a month's wages through legitimate channels are available here for a few days' earnings, but the reduced prices come with substantially increased risks of spiritual backlash and curse malfunction. And this is just the retail level of the black market curse industry. The wholesale operations that supply these street vendors involve organized criminal networks that specialize in supernatural smuggling, entity trafficking, and the theft of sacred materials from legitimate temple complexes. These criminal organizations operate with the same sophisticated methods used by any other form of organized crime. The recruitment techniques used by black market curse dealers target people who are emotionally vulnerable and financially desperate. The vendors are skilled at identifying potential customers who are suffering from recent tragedies, humiliations, or conflicts that make them susceptible to supernatural revenge fantasies. The sales techniques used in these markets combine psychological manipulation with genuine supernatural knowledge. The territorial disputes between different black market operations often result in supernatural warfare that can devastate entire neighborhoods. When rival curse dealers engage in business conflicts, they use their inventory of spiritual weapons against each other, creating curse battles that produce collateral damage, affecting innocent bystanders who have no connection to the original conflict. The law enforcement challenges created by black market curse dealing are complex and often insurmountable. The spiritual nature of the crimes makes them difficult to investigate using conventional methods, and the supernatural evidence involved in curse-related prosecutions is often inadmissible in legal proceedings. Many black market curse dealers operate with virtual impunity because their crimes can't be proven in court. The public health implications of unregulated curse making include spiritual contamination that can affect entire communities. The amateur curse makers working in these markets often lack the knowledge necessary to properly contain the supernatural forces they're manipulating, resulting in spiritual pollution that makes entire neighborhoods more susceptible to supernatural attacks. The addiction potential inherent in black market curse services is significantly higher than that associated with legitimate curse making. The reduced prices and relaxed ethical standards make it easier for clients to become dependent on supernatural revenge as a solution to their problems, leading to escalating patterns of curse usage that can consume their entire lives. The international networks that supply black market curse operations include smuggling routes that move supernatural materials and captured entities across vast distances. These criminal organizations have developed sophisticated methods for transporting spiritual contraband while avoiding detection by legitimate religious authorities who might interfere with their operations. The corruption of legitimate spiritual workers by black market operations represents one of the most serious threats to the stability of Egyptian religious institutions. Priests and temple workers who become involved with illegal curse dealing often lose their spiritual authority and become vulnerable to supernatural attacks from the entities they've betrayed. The social damage caused by black market curse proliferation extends far beyond the immediate victims of individual curses. Communities with significant black market curse activity often experience breakdown of trust, increased paranoia, and social fragmentation as residents become suspicious of their neighbors and fearful of supernatural attacks that could come from any direction. The technological innovations developed by black market curse dealers often involve dangerous modifications to traditional curse-making techniques that increase the power of their products while reducing the safety margins that protect both users and victims from spiritual backlash. These modified cursing methods can produce effects that are impossible to reverse using conventional counter-curse techniques. The ancient temple library, where you find yourself today, contains the last remaining copies of texts that describe advanced curse-breaking techniques developed by Egyptian spiritual warriors who specialized in neutralizing the most powerful forms of supernatural warfare. The priest studying these crumbling papyri, Kamwaset, represents one of the few remaining practitioners who understand the classical methods of curse neutralization that were once common knowledge among Egyptian religious professionals. Welcome to the dying art of Egyptian curse breaking, where sophisticated spiritual defense techniques are being lost as the knowledge required to perform them becomes increasingly rare and expensive to maintain. The texts being studied today describe methods for neutralizing curses that modern counter-curse specialists would consider impossible to break, revealing the advanced state of spiritual warfare technology that existed in earlier periods of Egyptian history. The curse being analyzed in today's session represents a particularly challenging example of ancient execration craftsmanship. The lead tablet contains multiple layers of supernatural binding that have been interwoven in patterns that create self-reinforcing spiritual structures. Each attempt to break one layer of the curse automatically strengthens the remaining layers, making conventional counter-curse techniques not just ineffective, but actually counterproductive. The diagnostic process used by classical curse breakers involved sophisticated spiritual analysis techniques that required years of training to master. Kamiwaset demonstrates methods for detecting the specific types of supernatural entities involved in curse construction, identifying the spiritual materials used in curse activation, and mapping the energy patterns that bind curses to their victims. These diagnostic techniques were once standard practice, but are now considered advanced specializations. But the most remarkable aspect of classical curse breaking involves the development of cooperative relationships with the supernatural entities that enforce curse effects. Rather than simply trying to overpower these entities or banish them from the victim, classical curse breakers negotiated alternative arrangements that satisfied the entity's needs while releasing their victims from supernatural bondage. The negotiation techniques used in these supernatural diplomacy sessions require deep understanding of entity psychology, spiritual law, and the complex political relationships that exist within the supernatural realm. Kamiwaset explains that successful curse breaking often depends more on diplomatic skill than on raw spiritual power, since forced solutions typically create more problems than they solve. And this is just the beginning of the classical curse breaking process. Once initial agreements have been reached with the enforcing entities, the curse breaker must perform complex rituals that carefully unwind the spiritual structures binding the curse to its victim without triggering defensive mechanisms that might intensify the curse effects or transfer them to innocent bystanders. The spiritual surgery techniques used in advanced curse breaking involve precise manipulation of the victim's spiritual anatomy to remove curse anchors that have become embedded in their soul structure. These procedures require the same level of skill and precision that physical surgeons apply to delicate medical operations, and the potential for spiritual damage is enormous if the procedures are performed incorrectly. The rehabilitation process that follows successful curse removal often takes months or years to complete, as victims must learn to function without the supernatural constraints that have shaped their behavior and limited their capabilities. Many curse victims have lived with their afflictions for so long that freedom from supernatural influence creates disorientation and anxiety that requires ongoing therapeutic support. The quality control standards that governed classical curse breaking were extraordinarily high, with practitioners required to guarantee that their interventions wouldn't cause additional spiritual damage to their clients. The liability issues associated with curse breaking work created professional standards that eliminated practitioners who couldn't consistently produce safe and effective results. The training programs that produced classical curse breakers involved decades of study and apprenticeship under masters who had themselves spent lifetimes perfecting their techniques. The knowledge required for advanced curse breaking includes not just spiritual theory, but also practical experience with hundreds of different curse types and thousands of individual cases. The research methods used by classical curse breakers involve systematic study of curse construction techniques,
allowing them to develop specific countermeasures for each type of supernatural warfare. This research created vast libraries of specialized knowledge that cataloged the strengths and weaknesses of different cursing methodologies. The international cooperation networks that connected curse breakers across different cultures created opportunities for sharing techniques and coordinating responses to particularly dangerous supernatural threats. These professional networks functioned like medical associations, maintaining standards and sharing innovations that benefited practitioners throughout the ancient world. The economic factors that are causing the decline of classical curse breaking include the high cost of training new practitioners and the reduced demand for advanced services in a society where most curse victims can't afford sophisticated treatment. The few remaining classical curse breakers command enormous fees for their services, making their knowledge available only to the wealthiest clients. The spiritual pollution that results from improper curse-breaking attempts has created environmental hazards that affect entire communities. Amateur curse breakers who lack the knowledge necessary to safely neutralize sophisticated curses often cause spiritual contamination that makes their clients' problems worse while creating new supernatural hazards for innocent bystanders. The preservation efforts being undertaken to save classical curse-breaking knowledge include detailed documentation of techniques and training methods, but the practical aspects of this knowledge can only be transmitted through direct apprenticeship with experienced practitioners. The written records being created today may preserve the theory of classical curse breaking, but the practical skills required to implement these techniques may be lost forever.
The luxurious villa overlooking the Nile serves as headquarters for one of Egypt's most successful curse-making enterprises, where the owner, Amenhotep III, has built a commercial empire based on the systematic industrialization of spiritual warfare. The opulent surroundings reflect the enormous profits that can be generated through professional curse-making when it's organized according to modern business principles and marketed to wealthy clients who demand premium supernatural services. Welcome to the corporate structure of Egyptian execration, where curse-making has evolved from individual craftsmanship into sophisticated business operations that employ hundreds of specialists and generate revenues that rival those of major trading companies. The enterprise you're examining today represents the pinnacle of curse-making commercialization, with standardized production methods, quality control systems, and customer service standards that have transformed spiritual warfare into a luxury commodity. The business model developed by Amenhotep III involves vertical integration of all aspects of the curse-making supply chain, from the mining of specialized metals to the training of supernatural entities to the delivery and activation of finished curse products. This comprehensive approach allows his company to maintain quality control at every stage of the curse production process while maximizing profit margins through elimination of intermediary vendors. The research and development division of this curse-making corporation employs teams of specialized priests who work full-time on developing new curse technologies and improving existing supernatural warfare methodologies. The innovation labs where these specialists work contain experimental equipment and rare materials that would be impossible for individual curse makers to acquire, allowing the development of curse types that are far more sophisticated than anything available through traditional channels. But the most impressive aspect of this commercial operation involves the systematic cataloging and classification of supernatural entities according to their specialized abilities and professional reliability. Amenhotep III maintains a supernatural personnel database that includes performance ratings, cost analyses, and compatibility assessments for thousands of different entities, allowing his company to match optimal supernatural workers with specific curse requirements. The quality assurance protocols used by this corporation include testing procedures that verify curse effectiveness before delivery to clients, guaranteeing that purchased curses will produce specified results within predetermined timeframes. These testing procedures involve controlled experiments using volunteer subjects who are compensated for allowing themselves to be used as targets for experimental curse applications. And this is just the production side of the business. The marketing and sales operations developed by this company have transformed curse making from a secretive underground service into a respectable luxury industry that attracts clients from the highest levels of Egyptian society. The customer service standards maintained by this corporation exceed those found in most conventional businesses. The training academies operated by this curse-making corporation produce graduates who staff curse-making enterprises throughout Egypt and beyond, spreading standardized methodologies and business practices that have revolutionized the spiritual warfare industry. The curriculum at these academies includes not just technical curse-making skills, but also business management, customer relations, and supernatural resource management. The international expansion strategies pursued by this corporation include establishing franchise operations in other countries and developing export markets for Egyptian curse-making expertise. The company maintains offices in major cities throughout the Mediterranean region, adapting Egyptian curse-making techniques to local spiritual traditions and regulatory environments. The financial instruments developed to support large-scale curse-making operations include insurance policies that protect clients from curse malfunction, investment vehicles that allow wealthy individuals to profit from the curse-making industry, and credit systems that make expensive curse services accessible to clients who can't afford to pay the full cost up front. The corporate espionage activities conducted by competing curse-making enterprises create a shadowy world of supernatural industrial warfare where companies steal trade secrets, sabotage competitor facilities, and recruit rival specialists using both conventional and supernatural methods. The competitive pressures in the luxury curse market have led to innovation rates that far exceed those found in traditional crafts industries. The regulatory compliance issues faced by large-scale curse-making operations include obtaining permits for supernatural entity employment, maintaining safety standards for curse production facilities, and complying with religious regulations that govern commercial spiritual warfare activities. The legal departments maintained by these corporations employ specialists in supernatural law who navigate complex regulatory environments. The supply chain management systems used by corporate curse makers involve global networks of suppliers who provide specialized materials, supernatural entities, and logistical services required for large-scale curse production. These supply chains include both legitimate vendors and underground sources that provide materials and services that aren't available through conventional channels. The human resources challenges faced by curse-making corporations include recruiting qualified specialists, maintaining morale among workers who deal with supernatural dangers on a daily basis, and providing benefits packages that compensate for the spiritual risks associated with professional curse making. The employee retention rates in this industry are notoriously low due to the psychological stress and supernatural hazards involved in the work.
The environmental impact assessments required for large-scale curse-making operations reveal the spiritual pollution that can result from industrial-scale supernatural warfare production. These assessments measure the effects of curse-making activities on local spiritual environments and develop mitigation strategies that minimize negative impacts on surrounding communities. The succession planning systems developed by curse-making dynasties ensure that the specialized knowledge and business relationships required for successful supernatural warfare enterprises are transferred to future generations. These planning systems include both conventional business succession strategies and specialized spiritual inheritance techniques that transfer supernatural contracts and entity relationships to designated heirs.
The strategic hilltop overlooking the Valley of the Kings serves as an observation post where you can witness the invisible warfare that rages constantly across the spiritual landscape of Egypt. The priest serving as your guide today, Thutmose, specializes in spiritual geography, the study of how supernatural forces interact with physical terrain to create zones of enhanced curse effectiveness and areas of natural spiritual protection. Welcome to the hidden topography of Egyptian execration, where certain locations serve as amplifiers for supernatural warfare, while others provide natural sanctuary from curse attacks. The landscape you're surveying today appears peaceful to casual observation, but Thutmose's trained eye can identify the spiritual battle lines that divide this territory into zones of supernatural conflict and neutral ground where spiritual combatants maintain an uneasy truce. The river systems that crisscross this region serve as natural conduits for curse energy, carrying supernatural attacks from their points of origin to distant targets with minimal loss of spiritual potency. The Nile itself functions as a massive spiritual highway where curse tablets buried along its banks can affect victims located hundreds of miles downstream. Thutmose points out specific bends in the river where the spiritual currents are particularly strong, making these locations premium sites for curse activation ceremonies. The cemetery complexes scattered throughout this area represent the most concentrated zones of supernatural activity, where the proximity of restless spirits and the accumulated spiritual energy of centuries of burial rituals create conditions that dramatically enhance curse effectiveness. The major necropolis sites serve as supernatural power plants where curse makers can tap into enormous reserves of spiritual energy to fuel their most ambitious execration projects. But the most strategically important features of this spiritual landscape are the intersection points where multiple sources of supernatural energy converge to create zones of amplified spiritual activity. These convergence points are jealously guarded by the curse-making organizations that control them, and conflicts over access to premium spiritual real estate have led to wars that play out simultaneously in the physical and supernatural realms. The defensive fortifications visible from this observation post include both physical structures and supernatural barriers designed to protect important locations from curse attacks. The temple complexes scattered throughout this region are surrounded by layers of spiritual protection that deflect incoming curses and neutralize hostile supernatural entities. These defensive systems represent centuries of accumulated spiritual engineering knowledge, and this is just what's visible on the surface. Thutmose explains that the most important spiritual warfare installations are built underground, in cave systems and artificial tunnels that provide protection from spiritual surveillance,
while allowing curse makers to work without interference from rival organizations or regulatory authorities. The territorial agreements that govern supernatural warfare in this region are as complex as any international treaty system, with different curse-making organizations maintaining exclusive rights to specific areas while sharing access to neutral zones where collaborative projects can be conducted. These agreements are enforced through a combination of supernatural monitoring systems and mutual deterrence policies. The resource extraction operations visible throughout this landscape include both conventional mining activities and specialized excavation projects designed to harvest supernatural materials that enhance curse effectiveness. The quarries where lead for curse tablets is extracted are carefully managed to ensure that the metal maintains its spiritual conductivity, while other mining operations focus on gems and minerals that serve as focusing elements for complex curse formulations. The transportation networks that connect different spiritual warfare installations include both conventional roads and supernatural pathways that allow rapid movement of personnel and materials while avoiding detection by hostile forces. These transportation systems are protected by elaborate security measures that include both physical guards and supernatural sentries. The communication systems used to coordinate supernatural warfare activities across this vast landscape include both conventional messenger services and supernatural communication networks that allow instantaneous contact between distant curse-making installations. These communication systems are regularly upgraded to maintain security against espionage activities conducted by rival organizations. The early warning systems that monitor this landscape for incoming supernatural attacks include networks of spiritual sensors that can detect curse energy from vast distances, allowing defensive forces to respond to threats before they reach their targets. These monitoring systems represent some of the most advanced spiritual technology available to Egyptian curse makers. The refugee camps scattered throughout this region house civilians who have been displaced by supernatural warfare activities, including families whose homes have become uninhabitable due to curse contamination, and communities that have been evacuated to prevent them from becoming collateral damage in spiritual warfare conflicts. The neutral zones that serve as meeting places for supernatural warfare negotiations are carefully maintained areas where representatives of different curse-making organizations can conduct diplomacy without fear of attack. These neutral zones are protected by complex spiritual agreements that automatically punish any organization that violates their sanctity. The seasonal patterns that affect supernatural warfare in this region include astronomical events that enhance or diminish curse effectiveness, weather patterns that influence spiritual energy flows, and religious calendar events that create temporary truces in ongoing spiritual conflicts. Understanding these patterns is essential for effective strategic planning in supernatural warfare. The archaeological sites scattered throughout this landscape provide evidence of supernatural warfare activities that date back thousands of years, revealing the long history of spiritual conflict in this region and providing insights into the evolution of curse-making techniques over time. These sites are carefully studied by both historians and active practitioners who seek to learn from past spiritual warfare strategies.
The abandoned playground on the outskirts of Memphis holds the tragic remnants of what was once a thriving neighborhood before a catastrophic curse warfare incident contaminated the entire area with supernatural energies that proved particularly toxic to developing children. The rusted swings and cracked stone benches serve as monuments to the dozens of young lives that were cut short by spiritual forces they couldn't understand or defend against. Welcome to the collateral damage of Egyptian execration warfare, where the most vulnerable members of society pay the highest price for the supernatural conflicts of their elders. The site you're examining today represents one of the most devastating curse warfare disasters in Egyptian history, when a conflict between rival curse-making organizations resulted in the deployment of supernatural weapons that specifically targeted the spiritual development processes of children. The incident began as a routine business dispute between two competing curse-making enterprises, but escalated when one organization discovered that the other had been stealing their clients and copying their proprietary curse formulations. The retaliatory measures deployed by both sides included increasingly sophisticated spiritual weapons, culminating in the release of a childhood binding curse that was designed to prevent enemy curse makers' children from developing the spiritual maturity necessary to continue their parents' work. The curse mechanism itself represented a horrifying innovation in supernatural warfare technology, a spiritual weapon that targeted the natural development processes that allow children to mature into healthy adults. The affected children became trapped in permanent states of psychological and spiritual childhood, unable to develop the mental complexity and emotional maturity necessary for normal adult functioning. But the most tragic aspect of this disaster was that the curse weapon missed its intended targets almost entirely. The specialized spiritual protection that surrounded the children of professional curse makers deflected most of the attack, while the supernatural weapon rebounded into the surrounding neighborhood and affected dozens of innocent children whose families had no connection to the curse-making industry. The immediate effects of the childhood binding curse were subtle enough that parents and teachers initially attributed the children's developmental delays to natural variations in growth rates. The affected children seemed healthy and happy, but they gradually stopped developing new interests, stopped asking complex questions, and stopped showing the intellectual curiosity that characterizes normal child development. And this is just how the curse manifested in its early stages. As the affected children grew older chronologically, the gap between their physical age and their mental development became increasingly apparent. Teenagers trapped in the psychological state of 6-year-olds faced social isolation and family trauma that compounded the supernatural damage caused by the original curse. The medical professionals who examined the affected children found themselves confronting a completely unprecedented syndrome that didn't respond to any conventional treatments. The physicians understood that they were dealing with some form of developmental disorder, but the spiritual nature of the underlying cause made their diagnostic tools and therapeutic interventions completely ineffective. The educational system struggled to accommodate children who possessed the physical capabilities of adolescents, but the cognitive and emotional development of much younger children. Special schools were established to provide appropriate learning environments, but the unique nature of the children's condition made it difficult to develop effective educational strategies. The family dynamics created by the childhood binding curse were particularly devastating for parents who watched their children's personalities freeze at specific developmental stages. The affected families experienced grief patterns similar to those associated with death, as they mourned the loss of the adults their children would never become. The social stigma associated with curse-affected children
created additional trauma for the families as community members feared that the supernatural contamination might be contagious. The neighborhood where the incident occurred became increasingly isolated as residents moved away and new families avoided the area. The legal proceedings that followed the disaster revealed the inadequate regulatory framework that governs supernatural warfare activities in civilian areas. The curse-making organizations responsible for the incident faced minimal penalties, partly because the existing legal system had no precedent for dealing with supernatural weapons that caused mass casualties. The long-term care requirements for the affected children created enormous financial and emotional burdens for their families. The specialized medical and educational services required to support curse-affected children were expensive and often ineffective, leading to family bankruptcy and social breakdown that extended the disaster's impact across multiple generations. The research efforts initiated to understand and treat the childhood binding curse led to advances in spiritual medicine that had broader applications for curse victim treatment. The specialized counter-curse techniques developed to address this particular type of supernatural warfare have since been used to help victims of other developmental curses. The memorial services held annually at the abandoned playground serve multiple purposes, honoring the victims of the disaster, maintaining community awareness of the dangers associated with supernatural warfare, and providing support for the families who continue to care for the affected children decades after the original incident. The policy changes implemented in response to this disaster include stricter regulations governing supernatural warfare activities in civilian areas, mandatory insurance requirements for curse-making enterprises, and improved early warning systems designed to detect and neutralize supernatural weapons before they can cause mass casualties. The international attention focused on this incident has led to the development of humanitarian protocols for responding to supernatural warfare disasters, including specialized teams trained to provide emergency spiritual medicine and long-term support services for curse warfare victims.
The counting house, where today's financial analysis is being conducted, reveals the staggering economic implications of Egyptian curse-making as both a luxury industry and a form of supernatural investment that can generate returns across multiple generations. The merchant banker reviewing these ledgers, Ptahhotep, specializes in financing large-scale curse operations and has developed sophisticated financial instruments that allow investors to profit from long-term spiritual warfare projects. Welcome to the economics of Egyptian execration, where supernatural revenge has become a commodity that can be bought, sold, traded, and leveraged like any other valuable asset. The financial records being examined today document curse investments that span decades, with some spiritual warfare projects designed to generate returns for centuries through systematic destruction of enemy family lines and business enterprises. The investment portfolio being reviewed today includes positions in various types of curse projects, from short-term business disruption, curses that provide quick returns through competitor elimination, to multi-generational family destruction curses that compound their effects over decades. Ptahhotep explains that the most profitable curse investments are those that target wealthy families with substantial assets, as the systematic destruction of such families through supernatural warfare can generate enormous returns for investors who position themselves to acquire the victim's property and business interests. The financial modeling techniques used to evaluate curse investments involve complex calculations that factor in the target's current wealth, their family's reproductive patterns, the estimated timeline for curse completion, and the projected value of assets that will become available when the curse achieves its objectives. These models use actuarial data about curse effectiveness rates and demographic analysis of target populations to predict investment returns with remarkable accuracy. But the most sophisticated aspect of curse economics involves the development of derivative financial instruments that allow investors to hedge their positions and manage risk in supernatural warfare investments. Ptahhotep demonstrates curse insurance contracts that protect investors from the financial losses that can result from curse failure, counter-curse interference, or unexpected target survival beyond projected timelines. The syndication methods used to finance large-scale curse projects involve multiple investors pooling their resources to fund supernatural warfare operations that would be too expensive for individual backers. These investment syndicates share both the costs and the returns of curse projects, allowing smaller investors to participate in major spiritual warfare operations while distributing the financial risks associated with supernatural investments. And this is just the investment side of the curse economy. The operational costs associated with professional curse making include expenses for specialized materials, supernatural entity contracts, ritual facility maintenance, and skilled labor that can consume enormous amounts of capital before any returns are generated. The financial planning required for major curse operations rivals that used for large construction projects or military campaigns. The market analysis conducted by curse investment firms includes detailed research into target selection, competitive analysis of rival curse makers, and economic forecasting that predicts optimal timing for different types of supernatural warfare investments. These market research efforts employ teams of specialists who monitor social, political, and economic trends that might affect curse investment performance. The accounting standards used for curse investment record keeping require specialized knowledge of supernatural warfare economics and the ability to track returns that may not materialize for decades after initial investments are made. The accounting firms that specialize in curse investment services maintain detailed historical databases that track the performance of different curse types and curse makers over extended periods. The tax implications of curse investments include complex regulations that govern the treatment of supernatural warfare expenses and returns. The tax authorities have developed specialized assessment methods for curse-related income and expenses, creating a parallel tax system that addresses the unique characteristics of spiritual warfare economics. The regulatory framework that governs curse investment activities includes licensing requirements for curse investment advisors, disclosure requirements for supernatural warfare investment vehicles, and consumer protection measures designed to prevent fraud in the curse investment industry. These regulations are enforced by specialized authorities who understand both conventional finance and supernatural warfare economics. The international aspects of curse investment include cross-border supernatural warfare projects and currency exchange mechanisms that allow investors to participate in curse operations in different countries. The development of international curse investment markets has created opportunities for geographic diversification while introducing new risks associated with foreign regulatory environments and cultural differences in supernatural warfare practices. The retirement planning services offered by curse investment firms include long-term investment strategies
that use curse warfare returns to fund clients' later years, while inheritance planning services help wealthy families use curse investments to eliminate rival claimants to family fortunes. These financial planning services treat supernatural warfare as a legitimate investment category alongside conventional assets. The bankruptcy procedures that govern failed curse investments include specialized courts that understand supernatural warfare economics and can adjudicate disputes involving curse-related assets. The liquidation of failed curse operations requires expertise in both conventional asset disposal and supernatural entity contract termination. The credit rating systems used to evaluate curse investment risks include assessment methodologies that analyze curse maker track records, target vulnerability profiles, and market conditions that might affect supernatural warfare effectiveness. These rating systems help investors make informed decisions about curse investment opportunities while providing curse makers with benchmarks for pricing their services. The economic impact of the curse industry on Egyptian society includes both direct employment effects and indirect economic activity generated by curse-related services. The industry supports thousands of direct employees while creating demand for suppliers, contractors, and service providers who may not be directly involved in supernatural warfare but benefit from the economic activity it generates. The technological innovation driven by curse investment capital includes research and development efforts aimed at improving curse effectiveness, reducing operational costs, and developing new types of supernatural warfare that create additional investment opportunities. The competitive pressures in the curse investment market have accelerated innovation rates in supernatural warfare technology.
The ancient sanctuary, hidden deep within the desert, serves as one of the few remaining refuges where victims of curse warfare can seek protection from supernatural attacks without fear of betrayal or exploitation. The priest who maintains this sanctuary, Amenemhab, represents a dying tradition of Egyptian religious practice that prioritizes compassion and healing over profit and revenge, offering services that have become increasingly rare in a society dominated by commercial spiritual warfare. Welcome to the resistance movement within Egyptian curse culture, where a small network of religious professionals has dedicated their lives to providing sanctuary and healing services for the countless victims of supernatural warfare who have nowhere else to turn. The temple you're entering today operates in defiance of the commercial interests that dominate the curse industry, offering free services to people who have been abandoned by both the legitimate curse-making industry and conventional religious institution. The sanctuary's location in this remote desert valley provides natural protection from supernatural surveillance while offering spiritual cleansing benefits that help neutralize curse effects. The isolation also protects the sanctuary's clients from the social stigma associated with curse victimization and provides a safe space where traumatized individuals can begin the healing process without fear of further supernatural attacks. The intake process used by this sanctuary reveals the devastating scope of curse warfare's impact on Egyptian society. Amenemhab interviews dozens of new refugees each month, documenting cases that include children suffering from hereditary curses, families destroyed by business-related supernatural warfare, and individuals whose lives have been systematically destroyed by enemies they may never have known they had. But the most heartbreaking cases involve people who have been victimized by the curse industry itself, clients who have been cheated by unscrupulous curse makers, amateur practitioners who have suffered supernatural backlash from their own failed curse attempts, and former curse industry employees who have been targeted for revenge after attempting to leave the business. The treatment methods used at this sanctuary combine traditional Egyptian healing practices with specialized techniques developed specifically for curse victim rehabilitation. Amenemhab has spent decades studying the spiritual anatomy of curse effects, developing therapeutic approaches that can gradually restore normal spiritual function to victims whose souls have been damaged by supernatural warfare. And this is just the medical aspect of the sanctuary's mission. The psychological counseling services provided here address the complex trauma patterns that develop in curse victims, including paranoia, depression, and social anxiety that can persist long after the original supernatural attacks have been neutralized. The counseling staff includes specialists who understand both conventional psychology and the unique psychological damage caused by supernatural warfare. The community integration programs offered by the sanctuary help former curse victims rebuild their lives and develop the skills necessary to function in a society where supernatural warfare is a constant threat. These programs include vocational training, social skills development, and spiritual protection education that helps graduates avoid becoming victims of future curse attacks. The research activities conducted at this sanctuary include systematic documentation of curse effects, analysis of treatment effectiveness, and development of new therapeutic techniques that could benefit curse victims throughout Egypt. This research is conducted without the commercial pressures that influence studies conducted by the curse industry, providing objective information about supernatural warfare's impact on human health and well-being. The underground network that connects this sanctuary with similar facilities throughout Egypt and beyond provides coordination for rescue operations and information sharing that helps maximize the effectiveness of curse victim assistance efforts. This network operates in secret to avoid interference from curse industry interests and government authorities who profit from the supernatural warfare economy. The funding challenges faced by these mercy temples require creative approaches to resource acquisition that don't compromise their independence from commercial curse industry interests. The sanctuaries rely on donations from sympathetic wealthy individuals, income from traditional healing services provided to non-curse related clients, and occasional support from international humanitarian organizations. The security measures required to protect sanctuary operations include both conventional defensive precautions and sophisticated spiritual protection systems that prevent curse industry infiltration and surveillance. The sanctuaries must constantly balance the need for security against their mission of providing accessible services to people who may be desperate and vulnerable. The training programs that prepare new Mercy Temple staff include intensive education in curse victim treatment methods, security protocols that protect both staff and clients, and spiritual protection techniques that prevent helpers from becoming targets of supernatural warfare themselves. The attrition rate among Mercy Temple workers is high due to the emotional stress and physical dangers associated with this work. The legal advocacy services provided by some Mercy Temples include efforts to reform the regulatory framework that governs supernatural warfare and to provide legal representation for curse victims who seek justice through conventional court systems. These advocacy efforts face enormous challenges due to the economic and political influence of the curse industry. The documentation projects conducted by Mercy Temples include systematic recording of curse warfare, atrocities, and preservation of testimony
from victims whose stories would otherwise be lost. This documentation serves both as historical record and as evidence for future legal proceedings that might hold the curse industry accountable for its impact on Egyptian society. The international outreach efforts conducted by Mercy Temple Networks include coordination with similar organizations in other countries and advocacy for international agreements that might limit the most destructive forms of supernatural warfare. These efforts recognize that curse warfare has become a global phenomenon that requires coordinated international response. The succession planning challenges faced by Mercy temples include the difficulty of finding qualified individuals willing to dedicate their lives to this dangerous and poorly compensated work. The knowledge and skills required for effective curse victim treatment are complex and difficult to transfer, making the loss of experienced practitioners a serious threat to the movement's continuity.
The mountain peak where you stand today overlooks a landscape that appears peaceful and prosperous, but the oracle who has brought you here, Nefertiti, possesses the terrifying ability to perceive the spiritual future that awaits Egyptian civilization if current trends in supernatural warfare continue unchecked. Her visions reveal a coming catastrophe that will make the curse warfare disasters you've witnessed seem trivial by comparison, or complete breakdown of spiritual order that will reduce Egypt to a wasteland haunted by uncontrolled supernatural forces. Welcome to the prophetic tradition within Egyptian curse culture, where gifted seers have dedicated their lives to warning society about the long-term consequences of treating supernatural warfare as a commercial enterprise rather than the dangerous spiritual technology it truly represents. The visions being shared today describe a future where the accumulated spiritual pollution from centuries of curse warfare reaches critical mass and triggers a supernatural apocalypse that destroys Egyptian civilization. The timeline for this predicted catastrophe extends several generations into the future, when the children and grandchildren of current curse warfare participants will inherit a world where supernatural forces have become so destabilized that normal spiritual protection methods no longer function effectively. Nefertiti's visions show cities where curse energy has reached such concentrations that simply walking through certain neighborhoods can cause spiritual contamination that leads to madness and death. The mechanism that will trigger this supernatural apocalypse involves the breakdown of the spiritual infrastructure that currently contains and channels supernatural forces in relatively controlled ways. The oracle explains that the massive spiritual energy generated by the curse industry is being stored in unstable spiritual formations that will eventually collapse, releasing centuries of accumulated supernatural destruction in a single catastrophic event. But the most terrifying aspect of these prophetic visions involves the transformation of the supernatural entities that currently serve the curse industry into uncontrolled forces that will turn against their former human partners. The demons and spirits that have been bound to serve in curse operations will break free from their contracts and begin a campaign of indiscriminate destruction that will target all human life rather than specific curse victims. The early warning signs of this approaching catastrophe are already visible to those who know how to interpret them. Nefertiti points out subtle changes in supernatural energy patterns, increasing incidents of curse malfunction, and growing reports of supernatural entities refusing to honor their contracts with human curse makers. These indicators suggest that the spiritual systems that support the curse industry are already beginning to destabilize. And this is just the beginning of the predicted sequence of events. The oracle's visions show a cascade of supernatural failures that will accelerate as the spiritual infrastructure becomes increasingly unstable. Ancient protective barriers that have protected major cities for millennia will collapse, allowing hostile supernatural forces to invade previously safe areas and turn them into hunting grounds for entities seeking revenge against humanity. The refugee crisis that will result from this supernatural apocalypse will dwarf any conventional disaster in Egyptian history. Nefertiti's visions show millions of people fleeing from supernaturally contaminated areas, carrying with them spiritual pollution that spreads the catastrophe to previously unaffected regions. The refugee camps will become breeding grounds for new supernatural threats as desperate people turn to increasingly dangerous forms of magical practice. The social breakdown that will accompany the supernatural catastrophe includes the collapse of conventional government authority as political leaders find themselves powerless to address threats that exist beyond the physical realm. The curse industry's commercial infrastructure will collapse as supernatural forces turn against their former employers, eliminating the specialized knowledge and equipment necessary for managing supernatural crises. The international implications of Egypt's supernatural apocalypse include the spread of spiritual contamination to neighboring civilizations through trade routes and refugee movements. Nefertiti's visions show the collapse of Egyptian civilization, triggering similar supernatural catastrophes throughout the ancient world as other cultures' spiritual defense systems are overwhelmed by the chaos spreading from Egypt. The few survival strategies that might allow small groups of people to weather this supernatural apocalypse involve complete abandonment of all supernatural warfare technologies and return to primitive spiritual practices that don't generate the types of energy pollution that will fuel the catastrophe. These survival communities will need to isolate themselves completely from the contaminated spiritual environment of mainstream Egyptian civilization. The preservation efforts that could potentially prevent this catastrophe require immediate and comprehensive reform of the curse industry, including strict limitations on supernatural warfare activities and massive investment in spiritual cleanup technologies that could neutralize the accumulated supernatural pollution before it reaches critical mass. However, the economic and political interests that profit from the current system make such reforms extremely unlikely. The documentation projects being undertaken by prophetic communities include detailed records of the visions and warnings that have been received about the coming catastrophe. These records are being preserved in hidden locations where they might survive the supernatural apocalypse and provide guidance for any humans who survive to rebuild civilization after the catastrophe. The international warning networks being established by prophetic communities include efforts to communicate with seers and spiritual leaders in other civilizations, sharing information about the coming catastrophe and coordinating potential response efforts. These networks recognize that the supernatural apocalypse predicted for Egypt could trigger similar catastrophes worldwide. The spiritual preparation programs being conducted by prophetic communities include training in advanced protective techniques that might allow some individuals to survive in the supernaturally contaminated environment that will exist after the catastrophe. These programs also include preservation of essential spiritual knowledge that will be needed to rebuild functional spiritual systems after the current infrastructure collapses. The recruitment efforts conducted by prophetic communities focus on identifying individuals with natural spiritual abilities who could serve as the foundation for post-apocalyptic spiritual leadership. These recruitment efforts face significant challenges
due to the skepticism and denial that characterize most people's response to warnings about supernatural catastrophe.
The hidden network of safe houses and secret transportation routes that you discover tonight represents one of the most remarkable humanitarian efforts in Egyptian history. An underground railroad dedicated to helping curse victims escape from supernatural warfare zones and find refuge in communities where they can rebuild their lives free from the threat of continued spiritual attacks. Welcome to the Mercy Network that operates in the shadows of Egyptian curse culture, where volunteers risk their own lives to provide escape routes for people trapped in cycles of supernatural warfare that threaten to destroy them and their families. The safe house you're visiting tonight shelters a family whose teenage daughter has been targeted by a hereditary curse that will activate when she reaches marriageable age, condemning her to a life of supernatural suffering unless she can be relocated to a community beyond the curse's geographical range. The transportation methods used by this underground network involve both conventional travel and specialized spiritual protection techniques that mask the refugees' spiritual signatures and prevent curse tracking systems from following them to their destinations. The convoy preparing to depart tonight includes wagons equipped with spiritual shielding that will hide the refugees from supernatural surveillance while they travel to their new homes. The route planning for these escape operations requires detailed knowledge of supernatural geography, including awareness of curse energy concentration zones, supernatural entity territorial boundaries, and safe passage corridors where refugee convoys can travel without triggering automated spiritual defense systems. The network maintains constantly updated maps that track the shifting patterns of supernatural activity throughout Egypt. But the most dangerous aspect of these rescue operations involves the active interference conducted by curse industry interests who profit from maintaining curse victims in their current situations. The Underground Railroad faces constant threats from curse-maker organizations that send supernatural hunters to recapture escaped victims and return them to the spiritual warfare zones where their suffering generates revenue for the curse industry. The screening procedures used to verify the legitimacy of rescue requests help prevent curse industry infiltration while ensuring that limited resources are allocated to the most deserving cases. The volunteers who conduct these screenings must be able to distinguish between genuine curse victims and curse industry agents who might be attempting to penetrate the underground network. And this is just the operational side of the Underground Railroad. The network also maintains rehabilitation facilities where rescued curse victims receive the medical treatment, psychological counseling, and spiritual cleansing necessary to help them recover from their supernatural ordeals. These rehabilitation centers operate with the same security measures used by the transportation network to prevent curse industry retaliation. The destination communities that provide permanent refuge for curse victims include isolated settlements where former curse refugees have established self-sufficient communities beyond the reach of Egyptian supernatural warfare infrastructure. These communities have developed their own spiritual protection systems and economic structures that allow curse victims to build new lives without fear of supernatural attack. The volunteer recruitment efforts conducted by the Underground Railroad focus on identifying individuals with both the practical skills needed for rescue operations and the spiritual abilities necessary to protect themselves and their clients from supernatural threats. The training programs for new volunteers include intensive education in curse victim identification, spiritual protection techniques, and security protocols
protocols. The funding mechanisms that support Underground Railroad operations include donations from sympathetic wealthy individuals, income from legitimate businesses operated by network members, and contributions from international humanitarian organizations that support curse victim assistance efforts. The network must carefully balance funding needs against security requirements that limit their ability to openly solicit support. The communication systems used by the Underground Railroad include both conventional messenger services and supernatural communication methods that allow secure coordination of rescue operations across vast distances. These communication systems use coded languages and spiritual encryption techniques that prevent curse industry surveillance from intercepting operational intelligence. The intelligence gathering operations conducted by the Underground Railroad include systematic monitoring of curse industry activities, tracking of supernatural warfare developments that might create new refugee populations, and identification of curse victims who would benefit from evacuation services. This intelligence work requires infiltration of curse industry facilities and social networks. The international cooperation efforts undertaken by the Underground Railroad include coordination with similar organizations in other countries and development of cross-border evacuation routes for curse victims who need to escape from Egyptian supernatural warfare jurisdiction entirely. These international efforts require diplomatic negotiations with foreign governments and spiritual authorities. The medical protocols developed for curse victim treatment include specialized therapies for supernatural trauma, detoxification procedures for spiritual contamination, and rehabilitation programs for individuals whose spiritual abilities have been damaged by curse attacks. The medical staff working with the Underground Railroad include specialists who understand both conventional medicine and supernatural healing techniques. The legal advocacy efforts conducted by Underground Railroad volunteers include attempts to reform Egyptian laws governing supernatural warfare and provision of legal representation for curse victims who choose to seek justice through conventional court systems. These legal efforts face enormous challenges due to the curse industry's political influence and the difficulty of proving supernatural crimes. The documentation projects maintained by the Underground Railroad include systematic recording of curse victim testimonies, preservation of evidence about curse industry atrocities, and compilation of historical records that demonstrate the true scope of supernatural warfare's impact on Egyptian society. This documentation serves both humanitarian and historical purposes. The succession planning efforts undertaken by Underground Railroad leadership include identification and training of next-generation volunteers who will continue the network's mission, preservation of operational knowledge and techniques, and establishment of permanent institutions that could survive the loss of current leadership. These planning efforts recognize that the Underground Railroad's mission may need to continue for generations. The security protocols that protect Underground Railroad operations include compartmentalized organizational structures that limit the damage that could result from infiltration or betrayal, regularly updated procedures for responding to curse industry attacks, and emergency evacuation plans for situations where safe houses or transportation routes are compromised.
And there you have it, the secret world of Egyptian curse tablets that archaeologists still find unsettling to this day. From the professional workshops where spiritual warfare was crafted with industrial precision, to the underground networks that tried to save its countless victims, you've witnessed a civilization that transformed supernatural revenge into a commercial enterprise that nearly destroyed the society it was meant to serve. The lead tablets scattered throughout Egypt's archaeological sites represent more than just ancient superstition. They're evidence of a systematic approach to spiritual warfare that reveals both the sophistication of Egyptian religious technology and the terrifying consequences of commercializing supernatural forces. Every curse tablet tells a story of personal conflict escalated into metaphysical combat, of ordinary grievances transformed into eternal suffering, and of a society that gradually lost its ability to distinguish between justice and revenge. What makes these ancient curses particularly disturbing is how closely they mirror the psychological patterns we see in modern conflicts. The same impulses that drove Egyptians to seek supernatural revenge against their enemies, the desire for justice, the need for control, the hunger for status, continue to shape human behavior thousands of years later. The technology has changed, but the fundamental psychology of revenge remains remarkably consistent across cultures and centuries. The business models developed by Egyptian curse makers would be familiar to any modern entrepreneur. They identified a market need, developed standardized products and services, created quality control systems, and built customer loyalty through satisfaction guarantees and repeat business. The curse industry included everything from research and development to international marketing, demonstrating that the commercialization of supernatural forces follows the same economic principles that govern conventional industries. But the most sobering aspect of Egyptian curse culture is how it demonstrates the potential consequences of treating spiritual forces as consumer goods. The supernatural apocalypse predicted by Egyptian oracles serves as a warning about what happens when societies lose respect for the forces they're attempting to manipulate. The accumulated spiritual pollution from centuries of commercial curse-making created environmental hazards that threatened the entire civilization. The victims of Egyptian curse warfare, from the merchants who never knew they were under attack to the children who inherited their grandparents' supernatural conflicts, remind us that the true cost of spiritual warfare is always paid by innocents who had no choice in the conflicts that destroyed their lives. The Underground Railroad that attempted to rescue these victims represents one of history's earliest humanitarian responses to supernatural persecution. The archaeological evidence of Egyptian curse tablets provides a unique window into ancient psychology, revealing how people thought about justice, revenge, and the proper relationship between the living and the supernatural realm. These artifacts document not just individual conflicts, but entire patterns of social dysfunction that resulted from the normalization of spiritual warfare. The economic analysis of Egyptian curse culture reveals how supernatural industries can generate enormous wealth while creating massive social costs that are borne by society as a whole. The curse industry's profits came at the expense of social trust, community cohesion, and individual psychological health, costs that were never reflected in the industry's accounting, but that ultimately threatened the stability of Egyptian civilization. The psychological sophistication of Egyptian curse makers demonstrates that ancient peoples possessed complex understanding of human motivation and emotional manipulation that rivals modern advertising and marketing techniques. The consultation processes used by professional curse makers included psychological assessment, emotional manipulation, and therapeutic elements that were remarkably advanced for their time.
The technological innovations developed by Egyptian curse makers included metallurgy, linguistics, and spiritual engineering that represented cutting-edge research in their respective fields. The lead tablets themselves were marvels of precision manufacturing, while the supernatural entities employed in curse operations required management techniques that would challenge modern human resources professionals. The international aspects of Egyptian curse culture reveal how spiritual warfare technologies spread across cultural boundaries and influenced religious practices throughout the ancient world. The export of Egyptian curse-making techniques created a global supernatural warfare industry that continued to evolve long after Egyptian civilization itself had declined. The regulatory failures that allowed Egyptian curse culture to develop unchecked provide lessons about the importance of maintaining ethical oversight of dangerous technologies. The absence of effective governance structures allowed the curse industry to develop into a threat to social stability that eventually required international intervention to contain. The resistance movements that developed within Egyptian curse culture, from the Mercy temples to the Underground Railroad, demonstrate that even in societies dominated by supernatural warfare, there were always individuals willing to risk their lives to help victims and preserve humanitarian values. These resistance efforts represent some of history's earliest examples of organized opposition to supernatural persecution. The prophetic traditions that warned about supernatural apocalypse reveal ancient understanding of environmental limits and the potential consequences of exceeding the carrying capacity of spiritual ecosystems. The oracles who predicted civilization collapse based on accumulated spiritual pollution were applying ecological thinking to supernatural phenomena centuries before modern environmental science developed similar concepts. So the next time you see a news story about archaeological discoveries in Egypt, remember that those lead tablets being carefully excavated aren't just historical curiosities. They're evidence of how advanced civilization nearly destroyed itself by treating spiritual forces as commercial products rather than respecting them as the dangerous powers they truly represent. The lessons of Egyptian curse culture remain relevant today as we face our own challenges with emerging technologies that have the potential to transform society in ways we don't fully understand. The story of how ancient Egyptians commercialized supernatural warfare serves as a cautionary tale about the importance of maintaining ethical oversight and social responsibility when developing powerful new capabilities. And with that sobering thought, it's time to let these ancient warnings fade into the background hum of your fan as you drift off to sleep, hopefully with dreams that are free from the spiritual warfare that haunted ancient Egypt. Until next time, sleep well, and remember that some powers are too dangerous to commercialize, no matter how profitable they might appear to be. Thanks for joining me on this journey through the darker aspects of ancient Egyptian civilization. Don't forget to like this video if you found it informative. Subscribe if you want more historical content that explores the hidden aspects of ancient cultures, and let me know in the comments what other historical mysteries you'd like me to investigate. Sweet dreams, and may your sleep be free from ancient curses.